Hi, I'm Ryan, a woodworker trying to grow a small business operating out of my small one-car garage. Watch along today as I put together a towel cabinet for a client's bathroom as part of a facelift they're doing. This cabinet is designed to fit right between their tub and their shower. I built it out of black walnut to match the floating shelves I made in a previous video. Watch along as we see what I can pull off in this small shop. Normally, I break down my rough lumber to the smallest sizes possible to mitigate the fact that I don't have a jointer. This allows me to either shim up the piece on my planer sled to flatten the side, or more often, the pieces are small enough that there isn't much wobble to them at all. In this case, I really wanted to keep the grain matched across the miters, so I didn't want to break it down at this point. I get a fair amount of snipe out of my planer, so I always have to keep my boards a few inches long on each side. I hope that I could get these flat enough by taking very light passes and then correct any minor issues that come up during the glue up using a ton of dominoes. After flattening the faces, I used my track saw to straighten one edge on each piece so that I could get a nice glue-ready joint. I have a few different ways that I clean up edges on rough lumber, but for long pieces like this, it's hard to beat the track saw. You really don't need to take much off here. I aim for the smallest amount possible, as you can see, to get that straight edge. I just need to make sure that I'm taking at least a fraction of an inch off of the entire board. Now that I have the edges cut and ready to glue up, I clamp everything together just to make sure it's super tight. I use this opportunity to make sure I'm okay with how the grain is lining up and then to quickly mark out where my dominoes are going to go. I used 5mm dominoes for this. I'm not at all worried about strength, as there's such a long glue joint on these edges that it should stay together without any issues. The dominoes are there just to align the top show surfaces during the glue up. My planer won't take a piece this wide, so I'm left to sand out any unevenness that comes from the glue up. I hate sanding, so this gives me the best bet at a flat surface. Then it's over to the clamps. I use Titebond 3 here. This is going to be installed in a bathroom, so the waterproofness of Titebond 3 might come in handy. Plus, to be honest, I bought a 4-liter jug of it, and it's the only wood glue I have, so it seemed like the right choice at the time. I let the glue dry overnight before removing the clamps. Everything was looking really good. I used one of those Richard lever bar scraper, painter's scraper things to scrape off the glue that squeezes out. It's maybe not the best tool for this, but it works really good and it really seems to cut down on my sanding, so I always do this when I have glue squeeze out of a line like this. I hit it quickly with the random orbit sander and some 80 grit sandpaper just to knock the rest of the edge off and to make sure that it's really nice and flat. I used my track saw again to rip a clean edge. And then use this as the reference edge for my track square to cut the first end off. I then flip the whole thing over, referencing the same cut edge to trim down the other end to length. These are oversized right now, but it makes it easier to work with and helps me square and true everything up. Part of working in a small shop is dealing with the proximity of the walls when you're dealing with longer pieces. I measured here and there wasn't enough room for this piece to fit between the overhead door and the saw, so it's time for an impromptu shop shuffle. I left the overall piece here a little bit wide when I ripped it down so that I could cut the edge detail. I wanted a 22.5-degree bevel on the front to match the bevel that I did on the floating shelves. So I set my saw blade to 67.5 degrees. I was fairly confident that this would be straightforward, but I thought it best to leave myself a bit of room for a mistake. As it turns out, it went off without a problem and I had a nice beveled front edge. Now that I had my piece for the cabinet cut to its overall final dimensions, I thought I'd try filling the knot holes and a couple small imperfections with some black CA glue. Overall, this worked fine, but it was a pain. It took a ton of glue, lots of it ran through to the other side and disappeared into the middle of the board, and it took forever to dry. I'm happy with the result, but I think next time I'll invest in a small amount of epoxy and try that. I've never used epoxy and honestly I'm a bit afraid of trying it. Any thoughts on what to use or tips for filling small holes or voids, please let me know in the comments. I appreciate it. And when you're there, if you're finding this video helpful, informative, or even entertaining, give me a quick like. Conversely, if you think this is just awful, you should probably let me know by punching that subscribe button so that you can be sure to critique my future videos as well. Now it was time to start working on the shelves. I used the router table to joint the edge on the smaller pieces to give me that good glue surface. This particular cabinet has 3 shelves, evenly spaced. I used some smaller offcuts I had to build these. I made sure that the panels are glued up so that the wood is in the same orientation as the cabinet body. That way, any future wood movement will affect the shelves and the cabinet body equally. I'm going to glue these shelves into place, so it's important that the entire piece can move as one, especially given that it's in a bathroom and it's going to be subject to a fair bit of humidity. I didn't feel like I needed dominoes to hold these together and keep them flat. The shelves are pretty small and I thought that they were flat and straight enough that I should just be able to glue them up, sand them, and be done. After letting the shelves dry for a few hours, I popped them out of the clamps and sanded them smooth. Just enough to take the glue off and make sure that they were perfectly flat. Moving back to the body of the cabinet, the first thing I did was mark out where I wanted the mitered corners to be. Again, I want to make sure the grain flows from one side to the other, so I spent a fair bit of time here making sure I could have the layout as appealing as possible and focus on where the top corners would be. The bottom corners won't be matched on one side, but obviously you won't be able to see them, so that should be okay. I cut the panel into 2 more manageable pieces using the track saw and the track square. I was then able to manage the crosscuts on the table saw using my new Incra Miter Express crosscut sled. I really like the sled, but you can see here that on a smaller saw like the SawStop CTS, a bunch of the sled on the right of the blade is fully unsupported. I wanted to lay out the lines and the positions for the dominoes before I mitered the corners. I feel like it's much easier to reference off of a square edge than it is off the inside of a miter. I clamped the 2 side panels together so that I could easily transfer my lines from the shelves over. This allowed me to make sure that all the shelves would be in the same position on both sides. Once all the dominoes were laid out, it was back to the table saw and the Incra sled to cut the miters. Since overall these panels were at their final dimensions, I was very careful to slowly sneak up on the miters. I wanted to make sure I didn't take anything off and shorten the length of the panels at all, just kissing that edge. Now that everything is cut to its final dimension, it's time for a quick dry fit. This gives me a chance to take a look at the miters and make sure that everything fits together before cutting the dominoes. I checked over everything a few times. Once the dominoes were cut, the shelf positions were locked in, so I wanted to be very sure that I was okay with how it looked, okay with the spacing, and ready to go. I decided to start by cutting the dominoes for the miters. These are pretty straightforward. I used the little edge guide tabs on the side of the domino to position away from each edge. Again, using 5mm dominoes, which I think I used for every domino in this project. I used the shelves here to lay out where the fence of the domino would go when cutting these on the side panels. You need to allow for a 3/8 inch setback from the cutting line for where you want to rest your fence. My original plan was to dado these shelves, but I wasn't confident in my ability to do a stop dado with the beveled front edge. I want the shelves to sit flush with the inside edge of the bevel, and the risk of blowing past that with a router was too high for me. Plus, I figured a couple of dominoes and glue would be more than strong enough for these shelves and their intended purpose. I again just used 5mm dominoes here, cutting deeper into the shelf than into the cabinet body. I wanted to make sure I wouldn't cut through the side of the cabinet. And now, everybody's favorite part of any woodworking project, I sand. I sanded everything starting at 80 grit and then going through 120 and finishing up at 180 grit. I've been getting really good results with Rubio Monocoat at 180 grit, so that's what I do. I'll spare you from watching the couple of hours of sanding time, but if you really want me to put together a sanding montage, just let me know. Before gluing, I thought it would be easier to give everything a quick wipe with this orange mineral spirits. I took off most of the dust and got it nice and clean and ready for the finish that was coming after it was glued up. I really debated finishing before I glued up, and in hindsight, maybe I wish I would have, but I didn't. I chose to glue it and then finish it. I thought this would be a pretty stress-free glue up, but I should have known better. Every time I glue something with miters, I end up with a fight on my hands. I struggle to get the miters tight and the box square. Times like this I can really see the appeal of having a second set of hands. Next time I'm going to skip using the band clamps, I think, and just try using the CA glued cauls in the corners, and just normal clamps to pull it together. I really do like the band clamps, but I find them hard to use when you're racing the clock. They seem to get tangled in everything. I bought this little Milwaukee M12 random orbit detail sander specifically for this project, knowing that I'd have some squeeze out and some tricky spots to clean. I have to say I'm not super impressed with it. It seems to not sand super fast, regardless of what grit of mesh you use. and it scratches like crazy. I bought it with a variety pack of sandpaper that goes from 80 to 180 grit, and they all seem to do a pretty bad job of removing glue and a pretty good job of leaving deep scratches. I'll keep trying it again, but I'm just not sold at this point. Even without finish on it, I have to say I love the way this is looking. The grain on this walnut is amazing, and it's for sure one of my favorite woods. After more sanding, wiping, vacuuming, and cleaning, it was finally time to apply the finish. I used Rubio Monocoat Pure for this. I was planning on just doing one coat, as that's what I've done in the past. I've had really good luck with it. Absolutely love this finish on walnut, and I have to say this is really starting to look nice. I cut the feet out of some of the 8/4 walnut offcuts I had left over from the floating shelves. You can check out that video if you're curious to see how I make solid wood floating shelves. I used my crosscut sled to cut the pieces to length, and then used a scrap of plywood to whip up a quick tapering jig. The legs are tapered on the inside face and vertical on the outside face. You might notice a change to my table saw here. I followed through on upgrading the CTS, and this was one of my first cuts on the new saw. I gave the bottom of each foot a small chamfer and then sanded them up on the oscillating belt sander. I thought for a while about how I was going to attach these and ended up deciding on a single domino. Now you might be asking yourself why I'm cutting dominoes in and attaching feet to a cabinet that has its final coat of finish already applied. The answer to that is I have no idea. I knew all along what I wanted to do for feet, and I guess I just forgot to do it. You might also be wondering how I could make cutting the dominoes into the cabinet any more awkward than this. When watching this video back, it dawned on me that I could have just laid the cabinet on the side and it would have been a lot easier. Funny how sometimes the obvious approach eludes us when we're focused on a task. The feet went on without too many other issues. I applied Rubio to them and a second coat to the outside of the cabinet and left it to dry. Thanks for watching along as I put this one together. It was a fun project that I was able to do over the course of a few days. I'm super happy with the results, and I hope you enjoyed watching along.